been Tucker Carlson and his stupidness or courage, depending on which side of the aisle you're reading from. He interviews Russian President Vladimir Putin. What were your thoughts on this interview, and was there anything that Putin said that stood out to you?
Well, the first thing that springs to mind is that Tucker is a very courageous individual. He knows the risks associated with going to Russia and interviewing the Russian head of state right now. As far as Washington is concerned, we are at war with Russia. We have no declared war, but we're doing everything short of committing our air, ground, and naval forces to the fight. What we've done is commit lots of advisors and clandestine individuals to support and make equipment work and systems work for the Ukrainians, and at the same time, huge quantities of money. So he's in a difficult position because from the vantage point of this government and most people in Washington, he's undermining the effort because he's gone to ask the foreign head of state for the truth. What is it? Why? What are you in this for? What is this really about? Everything I heard from Putin, I consider to be true and accurate, with the exception of one area where I was disappointed but not surprised. The problem in Russia is that the Russian government has not come to terms with the Stalinist period and communism. Now, everyone knows that communism was a disaster. But what the Russian people really are not aware of, they don't have the details. I think many of them know. Their instincts tell them this. Their fathers, grandfathers told them these things, but they are not really fully aware of the tens of millions of human beings that were murdered between 1918 and the beginning of the Second World War. Millions. And what people don't understand is that in 1939, when you had the Soviet-German pact between Ribbentrop, the German foreign minister, and Molotov, the Soviet foreign minister, this enabled Stalin and his armies to overrun Lithuania, Latvia, Estonia, and half of Finland, as well as nearly half of Poland. This resulted in the death either through deportation, execution, or simple exposure to the elements for millions of people that lived in those areas. That doesn't come up for discussion. Instead, everyone talks about, well, Hitler, Hitler, Hitler. There could not have been a Second World War without two things. First of all, without communism coming to power in 1918 and then consolidating its power through the murder of millions of human beings inside the Soviet Union, you would not have had the fear that emerged in the rest of Europe, particularly in Germany, where by the time Hitler is finally elected to office, and when I say elected, that's misleading, he had 32% of the vote, it was largely in response to the fear of communism inside Germany. People knew that millions were being starved to death, that somewhere between 7 and 10 million Ukrainians inside Ukraine were starved to death, an orchestrated famine. Those who were not starved to death deliberately by the removal of all food and the decimation of their families, the destruction of their property, were then shot on sight, raped and shot, or deported. And the difference between the concentration camp system that develops early in the 20s and lasts all the way into the early 1960s and the concentration camp that springs up after we go into, or after the Germans go into Eastern Europe, after the invasion of the Soviet Union, is that the concentration camps in Russia are in areas where the weather is so severe, the temperatures are so low, the food is so bad, the treatment meted out to the prisoners was so horrific, that within the first 30 days to 90 days to 6 months, almost everybody was dead. In other words, you didn't have to deliberately employ chemical means to eradicate the desired population. They died of exposure. And more people died between 1918 and 1941, we think, maybe more than died during the Second World War fighting against the Nazis. The other thing is that they talk about the Great Patriotic War, but 1.5 million so-called Soviet citizens volunteered for duty with the Wehrmacht. Hundreds of thousands of Russians, more than 250,000 Ukrainians, hundreds of thousands of Mongolian, Turkic Armenian, Georgian people, Tartars, all of them saddled up as soon as they could with the Germans against communism. That's what people don't understand. There were 2 million Soviet prisoners of war sitting in camps that were ready to volunteer and go out and fight with the Germans against the Soviets, something that Hitler refused to do, which was a terrible mistake. In other words, people don't understand that communism was the real cause of this horrific war. Now, that doesn't absolve Hitler, but it changes the complexion of the discussion. I didn't expect Putin to mention all of it, but the notion that you could have had a war at all without Stalin is ludicrous nonsense. And even in more material terms, when the Germans finally attack the West, when they go into Scandinavia and they overrun the Low Countries, defeat the British and the French and France, all of the oil, all of the raw materials, the food, the gasoline, everything is from Russia, supplied by Stalin, because Stalin hoped that the Germans and the British and the French would end up in a World War I scenario, in a stalemate, which would then offer him opportunities to attack from behind. Didn't work out that way, did it? But, you know, the problem is the Russians need to know the truth. They closed down the NKVD archives so that the Russians do not know the full truth. They were finding it out up until about 2001, 2002. People were becoming enraged when they found out that more than 15 Soviet soldiers died in the war. They were enraged when they found out that Stalin's NKVD executed 1 million Soviet soldiers who refused to fight the Germans. So this great patriotic war myth, if you will, is something they can't afford to destroy, at least in their minds. Now, everything that was said about Tsarist Russia from 932 up to 1918 was true and accurate. And however many mistakes the Tsars may have made, and however inhumane from time to time may have been, compared with what followed them, they were wild-eyed humanitarians. That was my problem. Now, Tucker couldn't push back against the head of state and say, you're not telling us the truth about what happened with Stalin. That was beyond the scope of this thing. But I'm disappointed that no one in Russia will stand up and tell the truth. Stop pretending that there was something good that happened under communism. There wasn't. It was the evil empire. The good news is that today's Russia has nothing in common with it. And if anything, it looks more like Tsarist Russia, only with a much more humanitarian face and a much higher standard of living. We should all be grateful for that, and they should take great pride in that. That's my personal frustration, that the truth just hasn't hit the light.
Gotcha. Oh, wow. Interesting. Yeah, I've seen many journalists that have come down hard on Tucker Carlson for not pushing back more or not bringing up the big questions. But when was the last time they were like in the Kremlin surrounded by soldiers? I would be pretty intimidated to go down paths that might get me in trouble while I'm stuck in a foreign nation.
Well, keep in mind something when he says the big questions for us are different. I mean, quite frankly, if Putin had wanted to, he could have started his rendition of history since 1989. That's really what's vitally important to us. And what he said was true. We goaded Russia into attacking eastern Ukraine. We made it impossible for them to stand by and do nothing. They had begged us privately, whatever you do, don't expand NATO to our borders. Don't do it. They tolerated the expansion into Poland, a state with a population that historically is incurably anti-Russian. I mean, the first thing that happened when Napoleon Bonaparte showed up is that he was joined by 50,000 Polish soldiers. And Poland didn't have 50,000 soldiers, so where did they come from? The population rose up and joined. And the Poles were in the forefront of urging Bonaparte to march on Moscow. So why, the first question is, in my mind at the time, I like the Poles, but why would we bring the Poles into NATO? I wouldn't have done it for the simple reason that it was a catalyst for conflict with Russia. Well, we did. We brought them in, along with Lithuania, Latvia, Estonia, all of whom have unhappy histories because of communism. Now, my point is this. he could have spoken about that, and he did, not as vociferously as I have, but he made the point that we had asked you not to do that. And it became clear that Ukraine was being transformed into this dagger pointed at our throats. I was glad that that came out and that was true. The big questions are not, well, Mr. Putin, why are you evil? Mr. Putin, why do you want to attack the West? That's all nonsense. That is just irrelevant nonsense. The other thing is that he pointed something out that I think we should all take note of. He said, what are you doing in Ukraine? What is there here for you? You have problems at home. Look at your $34 trillion debt. He said 33. It's actually 34. And we've got $1 trillion a year now to service our national sovereign debt. It's unsustainable. It's just a question of when it all falls apart. And he says, what's your interest here? Why are you doing this? You have other fish to fry, so to say. In other words, why are you meddling in the internal affairs of others? And that's what we've been doing for 50 years off and on. It's got to stop. And the justification for meddling is, well, you're not sufficiently democratic. Well, I think a lot of people looking at the United States today are wondering about our republic and just how democratic it is. That's another matter. But we got to get back to Washington and Hamilton, who made the argument that America should become the world's engine of prosperity. And if we are successful with our government, with our economy, people all over the world will admire us and they'll want to emulate us. And that was in response to Jefferson, who, like the French Revolution at the time, wanted to export revolution at the point of a bayonet. Washington and Hamilton said, if we're going to export revolution, let's do it peacefully along the lines that I just described. Let's show people just how good it can be, and others will say, yeah, right, they've got a good model. Let's pick it up and emulate it. We've done the opposite, and now we're increasingly isolated in the world.
Yeah. The things that stood out to me were exactly what you brought up, where Putin is like, he leans back, he's like kind of confused. He's like, why are you guys funding Ukraine? You've got, 33 trillion in debt, your borders being invaded. You've got more problems with your politicians than any other country that we are monitoring. Do you think that sometimes the world has a more clear picture of the corruption within DC than even the American people have?
Well, I've asked that question, and members of my family have traveled recently to Europe, and they tell me that our brand, remarkably, is still not severely damaged. That people still do impute a degree of decency and respect to the United States that it has not shown others, and that our military power is intact, which it's not. Our brand has not yet suffered grievously, despite the obvious failures. Maybe that's because America still remains something that the world wants to believe in. In other words, they want to believe that the things that we tell people we are really are true, when in reality we know America is flawed. Every society is flawed. There's no perfect society. And I think it was the other message that Putin had. You're imperfect. We're imperfect. Why are you doing this? But we've lost our sense of humility if we ever had it. We've replaced it with arrogance and ignorance, and that's where we are. But no, the whole world hasn't figured it out, but they're getting there.
Yeah. Another thing that stood out to me was, and I don't think this was theatrics. I mean, I don't know how to read, the Russian face very well, but Putin seemed genuinely confused why NATO and the United States haven't tried harder to seek for peace and to end the conflict. And then he went into great detail about how they had already drafted this peace agreement and that Russia had signed their side and that there were parts of the Ukraine side that had been signed and that they were trying to get other parts signed off and they were ready to go. And then under the direction of Joe Biden, UK Prime Minister Boris Johnson shows up and ends the whole thing. And then Putin kind of lays it at his feet where it's like, listen, you guys are the ones that interrupted the peace process. But he seemed genuinely confused why we haven't sought for peace more. Of course, now Boris Johnson is saying that Tucker Carlson is a traitor to humanity and to the West because he's trying to maybe absolve himself of 500,000 people being dead because of his interference. But you and I have covered that story extensively, but it may have been the first time, 100 million people heard that those peace deals were happening and that the United States and the United Kingdom blew those up.
Yes, I don't think people are aware of all the facts on that subject. I think more broadly, we need to understand that his rendition of history, when he starts in 932 up to the present, he's reminding people of several things. First of all, Russia has endured terrible wars over many centuries. Not all of those wars have gone well for Russia, obviously, and millions have suffered. But at the end of the day, the Russian state remains. He's saying, we are Russians. We're not going anywhere. We live here. There are 140 million of us. You need to come to terms with that and stop pretending that somehow or another you can disband us. You can divide us into smaller regions and rule us. It's not going to happen. We are here. We're not going anywhere. I think that's an important message for us. We've lost sight of this business of national identity and culture and language and religion, how important those things are, how they make up the national identities of most states and most peoples. We've watched ours diluted to the point now where national monuments, many of which were put up after the Civil War as a means of reconciliation between the North and the South, are being dismantled and destroyed, where monuments to Lincoln, to Jefferson, and Washington and others are defaced or being removed. We stand around and we shake our heads, but we let our government do these things. These things are impossible in Russia. That's the first thing. The second thing is he's trying to make the point that the Ukrainians, the people that live in this place called Ukraine, are different, but they've lived next to the Russians for a very long time. They are both overwhelmingly Russian Orthodox Christians. In other words, we would say in the United States, just Orthodox Christians, but they have been part of effectively the same state for same church for centuries. There has never been a desire in Moscow in the 1990s or now to destroy or to eliminate Ukrainians. Far from it. They want to get along with the Ukrainians. Now, we can talk about, what happened in the past, and I mentioned that. And we in the West have exploited that ugly history to try and stir up anti-Russian sentiment. But he doesn't see the people living in Ukraine as an enemy. He has never wanted to kill large numbers of them. If you want to compare and contrast warfare right now, if you see what's happening in Gaza, that is clear and unambiguous evidence for absolute hatred. Do you understand me? Real hatred that is aimed at the Arabs to destroy them, to eliminate them. That's not present in Moscow vis-a-vis Ukraine. They want this war to end. They want a reconciliation. And he said at some point this will end, and these two peoples will once again return to a state of mutual respect and understanding. I think he's right. They probably will. We're doing everything we can to prevent that. But if he were interested in doing to the Ukrainians what the Israelis are doing to the Arabs, we would have seen a very different war, because he's always had the military power potential to utterly devastate and destroy Ukraine. He hasn't done it.
That's really interesting, because there really is like horrible, 1,000 years of hatred between the Jews and the Arabs in that region. But there hasn't been that kind of hatred towards each other, especially with that common Slavic Orthodox Christian background that the two countries share. What were your thoughts from a military perspective about Zelensky asking or forcing General Zaluzhny to step down? Was that a PR function, or was removing Zaluzhny a good option?
Rearranging the deck chairs on the Titanic.
Okay.
Ukraine is finished. The Ukrainian government is a facade. The Ukrainians have given all that they can give. The individual Ukrainian that has fought in that war has done what Ukrainians have always done, fought very courageously and with great determination. They've largely run out of able-bodied men. And now they want to bring back whatever Ukrainian men they can find from overseas so that they too can be suited up and killed in front of Russian defenses, which have turned out to be largely impregnable. So I think what we need to come to terms with is that the government is falling apart. It doesn't make any difference who takes over and who shows up tomorrow morning to run the place. It's over. Now, some of the individuals that are being pushed forward by the current regime, the Zelensky regime, as I call it, are people who are useful instruments for MI6 in London and the CIA. They'll do what we tell them to do. And what are we telling them to do? We're telling them to use whatever missiles we can provide to them or unmanned systems to do harm to Russia, to harm Russians inside Russia. In other words, attack towns, cities, villages inside Russia. It's kind of a pointless revenge weapon. It's similar to the foolish order that was given by Hitler in 1944. Well, if we can't hold Paris, burn it. We actually gave that order, and the German commander, of course, ignored it. That's kind of the mentality that you're dealing with Zelensky. If we can't have it, then we're going to destroy it. If we can't win on the battlefield, we'll just harm Russians. This won't work. This will make matters worse. And with each passing day, grudgingly, the Russians are moving further to the west. I imagine that they will probably, over the next couple of months, go to the river, because I don't think they'll have much choice. And then the decision will be, what do we do now? Are we going to get some sort of arrangement, or do we sit here while the United States and Great Britain and some of its friends in Western Europe try to turn Western Ukraine into a kind of guerrilla warfare state that is constantly lobbing missiles or performing acts of sabotage or terror against Russia? Now, if that turns out to be something that cannot be resolved, then the Russians have the military power and the capability to go all the way to the Polish border. But that's not something they want to do for the reasons that I've already described. The question is, what do we do? Now I don't know what happens in the fall. Assuming we get to an election and we hold an election, I don't know who's going to win. I hear lots of statements from different people. I'm quite certain that Donald Trump says, well, I can end this in 24 hours. He talks about a lot of things he can do in 24 hours. There's a lot of history to suggest that just about nothing can be done in 24 hours. So whatever you decide to do will take months. I think RFK Jr. is trying to say the same thing. If I'm there, I'll put an end to this and so forth. But again, it's going to take time. And remember that if you're sitting in Moscow, the first question you have to ask is, why should I believe anything the Americans say at all? And with good reason. We've lied repeatedly about everything. Oh, don't worry, we'll never advance NATO beyond the Oder-Neisse, beyond Germany's borders. Well, that went away. Well, we'll never move, beyond the Polish border, and that went away. Not only do we want to bring Ukraine into NATO, we want to bring Georgia into NATO. We want to encircle Russia and destroy it. We won't be satisfied until there's regime change in Russia. I mean, this is crazy, but if you're sitting where they are, the question you have to ask is, why should I believe anything? What we don't know is what happens in the meantime in Europe. How much longer will the governments in Germany and France and other countries last? Most importantly, frankly, in Germany and Poland. Right now, the Poles have a government that is an EU transplant. I don't think it's going to last because I don't think the Poles want it. So I think we could see some change there sooner rather than later. In Germany, it's hard to tell. I'm always astonished at the readiness and the willingness of the Germans to follow bad government to the bitter end, even if it costs them their standard of living, their prosperity, their health, their economy. But they have a history of this, as we know. They did this up to the bitter end in 1945. They seem to be doing the same thing with Scholz and his crew, who are awful. I mean, why would you want to turn away better relations with Russia that would provide you with the energy you need more cheaply, more readily than you're going to get anywhere else, especially when the Russians want and need your products. In other words, this is a symbiotic relationship. This is something that's worked well for Germany and Russia for centuries. If you go back over the last 300 or 400 years of history in Europe, the two world wars are really anomalous. They're not the standard. The standard is cooperation for reasons of common sense, rationality, and economics. So when will this change? I don't know, but I think the Russians are still looking for change in Europe first. And they're very suspicious of our ability to change anything. I mean, if you've listened to Putin before, he has said, I've known many presidents and I've liked them and gotten along with them. And you know what? It made no difference. And he's not wrong. And while Donald Trump was president, it made no difference. So if he's going to come to power in the fall, or RFK Jr. comes to power in the fall, they're going to have to make a clean sweep of Washington. You really do. You literally need to fire everybody in the Departments of Defense, the Department of State, the Department of Education, the Department of Energy. It's all got to go. In some cases, you may want to disband as much as possible. The intelligence agencies are similar. You've got to start with a clean sheet. That's very difficult to do. And until I see evidence for new blood, in other words, rosters with names of people on it who are not swampists, who are not swamp creatures, who have no experience in the swamp, I'm very skeptical. I keep telling people, anybody who comes out of the Ivy League schools right now or the service academies are effectively poison. They're woke. They're part of the problem. Don't go back to those places. It's like drawing poison from the poison well and drink more of it. You've got to get out of the Beltway. You've got to go out into America. And I hear people say, well, you've got to find people who are qualified. Well, if you're